Hello, my name is Ina. I'm a Final Fantasy XIV player since 1.0. I am playing on the North American servers. And I had a video up some weeks ago that Preach Gaming would also start playing Final Fantasy XIV, and I'm actually looking very much forward to his journey. And I regularly watch the videos he uploads on YouTube because I am not able to actually watch it live because of the time difference and me actually working when he is streaming or sleeping, depending. Anyway, I saw he for once put out a different kind of video from his journey, basically, which titled "The Game Has No Talent Tree." And yes, we knew, obviously, the game does not have a talent tree. Thank God for that, because I hate talent trees in MMOs. They are utterly useless because someone will figure out relatively quickly what the optimal skill allocation is, and then everyone is using it anyway, and the entire tree is totally wasted. Anyway, let's see what he has to say and think about Final Fantasy not having a talent tree.
There are no talent trees in this game. What? Did you guys know that? Of course you knew that. You guys have played this game before, but that is one of the many discoveries I have made over the last 2 or 3 days that I really want to talk about today. Before we get to that though, check this out. New toy, Razor Blade 2020.
Skip that.
This was a lifesaver. Level 40, which means I have crossed over the level 30 mark, which is the actual decision on becoming a specific job. You can still swap your to another job if you want to, but at this point you've very much committed into the final stretch, and that is going to be a black mage for me. As I mentioned in the first video, I think this was a wonderful choice for me because it really dissolved the long global cooldown effect of playing in the early game of Final Fantasy. This made life so much easier, and I'm very much enjoying that. One thing that's really been surprising about this,
that's actually something I never have really thought about it, but I can see where he is coming from, where he is saying that the particularly the casters make the cooldown feel less relevant because you're actually casting, and when you're done casting you cast again because the skill is up. So I can see for people who really have a problem with a long cooldown timer, where casters can help with that. So if you have a friend who thinks, oh, it's such a long cooldown timer, maybe do suggest a caster. Another caster early game would be Summoner. They are also a lot of casting before they are later switching to a lot of instant casts. But that should be helpful. I never thought about that. It's a really good point, actually.
Is the story. Before coming into this, I had all these perceptions and ideas. One of the things was I was going to hate the Lalafell. Very squeaky, similar to how I hate Ardenweald in World of Warcraft, is the very squeaky, the very overly cutesy stuff doesn't work for me at all. I find it a little bit creepy, and it makes me, like, it repulses me a little bit. Lo and behold, though, the Black Mage storyline, in fact, the entire Thaumaturge storyline involving the 5 or 6 Lalafell brothers with ridiculously cutesy names like Kokobusi and Kokobuki, was easily one of the most engaging things I've done so far, and it still continues to be even after I have rounded out that story and moved into the next story. The Lalafell story, but it was really good. It had good writing, it tied itself up perfectly, it set up a character that I was sympathetic for, I could empathize with the other brothers' reactions to it, it got dark, it got creepy. I'm mentioning that. There are some really dark elements of this story that I absolutely...
To the Lalafells, I feel like that is often very much a little too much. Asmongold is someone I think of when it comes to the topic of the Lalafells. I mean, they are not actually as cutesy as you think, especially for people who are a little bit further in the game already know that Lalafells can be quite evil, actually. But it's just that just because they are tiny does not necessarily mean they're just some cutesy, high-pitched joke characters. A lot of the Lalafells in this game have very important stories, some of them very sad, some of them very evil. They are having the same stories of everyone else. They are just tiny people. and not some joke characters. He is about to say something. I assume this particular scene in English depicts the potential. They use very the words they are using make you think that the girl that you're seeing on the screen was raped. So I would like to point out, in other languages this is not the case. In German in particular, it is said that she was only laughed at, and there is implied there was some kicking. I mean, it's still terrible, but there was not the implication that she was raped. That is only in the English version. So keep that in mind.
Absolutely was not expecting. There has been several references to rape, which was really shocking when it came out of there. Some serial killer murders, mutilations, all the kind of things that I would hope and have expressed over the years would love to see in World of Warcraft. I always talked about the storylines involving basically the drug addict members of Suramar and how that got me involved. I like the dark, macabre stories. I like that mixed with my comedy. And Final Fantasy has plenty of comedy mixed into it, but also goes that little bit further into the darkness, alongside, of course, some very overly anime and Power Ranger type stuff, which I'm still not clear on what's happening there with the Empire, but I am interested. Stories of them hiding machines in the forest. What are they doing there? They've been spotted. They turn up every now and again, and much to my surprise, when they turn up, I recognize them. And I'm thinking, what's going on there? Like, why are those guys here? Also spotting a number of FF references, such as Biggs and Wedge are now part of the story, which is something even a lowly FF historical player like myself can recognize.
This is actually in particular why I think Preach has a little bit more appreciation for Final Fantasy XIV, because while you don't have to know anything about Final Fantasy, if you did play any other Final Fantasy games, there will be many references in there that will make you smile, or might give you some nostalgia. The latest raid that we had a lot of elements of Final Fantasy VIII, including some music or some specific animation that was used in the raid that came directly from the game, and for a lot of people that was, oh, great. And I think he would really appreciate this kind of stuff.
Nice. It also was the point at level 30 when we crossed into the actual specific Black Mage quest lines that I was expecting a talent tree, because every RPG in the universe has a talent tree, and it does not have one. Now, this has really blown my mind. What a ballsy decision to say we're not going to have talent trees in our RPG. Now, this has risen a great deal of questions in my eyes. Primarily, how balanced is this game? Now, this is a game that dissuades the use of damage meters, and I want to talk about that later. It dissuades the idea of measuring players by their performance. So how balanced is the game? Now, my theory is it's probably, now there's no talent trees, really balanced. The gearing system, from what I can see so far, is extremely simplistic. There's 7 or 8 stats. Only 4 or 3 of them are relevant to a specific caster or a melee character, which means people have a very specific amount of skills. The skills that you're getting...
I will take the spoiler ahead here and say it is very balanced. Unlike in other games, we do not have a lot of balancing in between patches, or usually you have, when the expansion comes out, there might be some slight updates in the next patch just to make sure everything works. Then there might be one job in particular falls really off. They might do a slight rework in the middle of the expansion cycle, but other than that, we really get reworks or numbers getting crunched or stuff like this. All classes are viable, all classes do what they are supposed to do, all classes are perfectly balanced. Well, not perfectly, but they are within a certain damage area. I think it's less than 5% currently. So it's perfectly fine.
Are very clearly designed to work in a certain way, and I do want to come back to that a little bit. And you have this very basic gearing system, which means without talent trees which start to deviate the paths and allow for weird combinations and players to experiment, The pro is the developers should be able to create a very, very balanced game at endgame. But you can't tell right now. Now, obviously, I'm fully aware there are ways of telling. You can get a damage meter. You can get logs. And the logs are apparently really, really good. But I'm going to ignore that for now. I'm going to wait until I reach the end game before I see how well balanced it is. But my theory is it's probably very well balanced because they don't have to deal with the amount of nonsense that is piled onto a World of Warcraft character where the players can go a little bit wild with it. On the downside of that, players can't really go a little bit wild with things. They can't experiment, they can't have fun. At least I can't yet. Going back to the skills thing then. So they're still in this situation, which is something World of Warcraft changed a long time ago, where they're drip feeding you abilities, but obviously this is designed for end game play. So every now and again, I do get abilities that don't really make sense. It's especially with my character's ability, my character's main theme, which is I swap from a nuke phase to a mana conservation phase, very similar to an arcane.
This actually is a thing. It is not as bad on Black Mage as there are other jobs. Monk, actually. They will change it in the next expansion, but Monk would be someone who is missing a lot of skills to work and get an actual rotation until way level 50. This is unfortunately, he is right, this is unfortunately the truth. With the levels getting higher and higher, there was the problem we had too many skills, so they removed skills or went to change skills, and suddenly you're sitting around with skills that actually don't do anything yet because you do not have certain traits to actually activate these, make real use of these skills, which is why I guess another reason why the cooldown timer can be so obnoxious in the first 50 levels, since for most jobs currently you do not have an actual rotation until level 50. Some jobs don't even have a rotation until level 60. So yeah, that's a thing. So hopefully with the next expansion they will maybe remedy that to move skills again around. We already know for the monk, the chakras, it's a very specific game mechanic that they have. The chakras will be starting earlier as soon as the expansion hits. That should be helpful for monks that want to level monks. But yeah, this is actually a thing.
Mage in World of Warcraft, and I swap backwards and forwards between them. And then I get new spells which allow me to swap easier, but they have very, very long cast times, which don't seem to make sense with the gameplay, but they will later on, because then you read through the traits and you're like, oh, that will actually become an instant cast proct ability, like a Pyroblast or something like that. So you can imagine if you're a vanilla World of Warcraft player, because I'm basically playing through vanilla Final Fantasy, is getting Pyroblast. You're like, oh, this is massive. Wait a minute, this thing takes forever to cast. And it's like, oh, it's supposed to work like this later on. That's something they could maybe do with remedying a little bit to improve the gameplay. Because, as I said in the first video, the gameplay is atrocious. Now, my gameplay is getting better, which is fantastic. It is slowly getting better. And I can, again, I'm not complaining about it because I know it does eventually get better. It can definitely do with a little tweaking earlier on to make the gameplay much better. Right now, I would say that Final Fantasy is walking this fine line by having you do the main story quest only. That provides more than enough experience to actually proceed through the game without having to do any side quests. I have done a couple now because you guys recommended it. They've been okay, but they are side quest stuff that you would expect in an early MMO. But by doing the main story quest on its own, there's very, very little gameplay, which means the drab and slow and kind of obnoxious nature of the early gameplay in the game is really kind of obfuscated because they're not asking you to do a lot of it. You might go through 4 or 5 story beats before you actually do some gameplay, and then typically that gameplay is either a big set piece, so your interest is actually more on the set piece that's happening. They use these scenarios very well. Or they're asking you to kill 1 or 2 enemies max. That's it. And then go back to doing some more story stuff. So they're kind of walking a fine line, and it's working pretty well, I have to say, because I think genuinely, if they were asking me to do 15 bear asses, 12 raptor eyes, I would start to get much more frustrated with the gameplay. But as it is, you do a little piece of gameplay. They probably are fully aware their gameplay is pretty bad early on. They're not really sure about how to revamp it or if they even want to revamp it. and therefore they get you back into the story again. Now, this...
Well, since they just revamped it and cut out a lot of stuff, that's probably it for a little while. I hope the next thing that they will be doing is taking the last 2 dungeons of A Realm Reborn and make them a single-player dungeon. Mostly because there is very little challenge at this point anyway, because everyone is over-geared. One of the last rewards in A Realm Reborn is, for the base game, is that you actually get the updated artifact gear. So you already are eye level wise way above what you would have been 7-8 years ago. So I'm hoping they will make that into like solo dungeons, or maybe take some NPCs with you or something. I think they should be taken out of the roulette rotation, even though I will hate it because it's a great amount of EXP, but story-wise it sucks.
Brought up an interesting discussion that we were having, which was, how would you recommend the game so far in terms of boosting versus leveling? And there's some very stern and stiff opinions on this matter. And if you're not into listening to a lot of story, even though that story is pretty good, but it is a lot, and a huge amount of the story in FF is literally travel across half the world, talk to a guy, travel back halfway across the world, talk to another guy, travel halfway across the world in a different direction, talk to another guy. There's like 5 or 6 of those in a row, which can start to feel very tedious. Luckily, they don't push it too far. But part of this is because I'm streaming. So during all this, I can talk to other people while it's happening. If I was a solo player, I would be... If I wasn't into the story, I would definitely be like, ugh. And then you mix it with the gameplay being a bit much. I like the story, so I'm fine. So I would recommend to me to level from scratch at least once. But I could certainly see people who are just purely gameplay focused being like, don't do it. If you're someone who's just going to skip through the story, like after the first 3 minutes, just click, 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 where do I go now? Click, 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 where do I go now? That boosting's not actually a bad idea. I know some people really hate that, but that's my honest opinion on that. I think that's the way it should go. Let's talk about... I talked about my gameplay improving. I do want to talk about the damage meter aspect for a little bit. I was never somebody who shit on people with a damage meter. For me, I do miss it. I miss it because I don't know if I'm contributing in any way. And that's a really tricky thing for me to try and process, is I like a performance metric in order to...
The thing dies, you obviously contributed. Like, seriously. Especially on a low level like this, you really don't need ATC. ACT, not ATC, ACT. Also, always a reminder, if you use a damage meter, when you're going with random people, keep your mouth shut about it and do not use it to flame any other person, because it can get you banned. There are actually streamers, Arthas being one of them, who can tell an entire tale about that.
Figure out, am I doing things correctly? Is this worthwhile? Is this bad? Those kind of things. Am I being carried right now? And you don't know in the base game of FF. You have absolutely no idea. So you kind of have to go with, it feels like I'm doing okay, but, I mean, it doesn't matter. The dungeons I've done, and I'm going to get into dungeons in a second, are pretty easy. But is that because of other people, or is it because of me? And that kind of stuff is really kind of messing with my brain a little bit, because I wander around, I'm trying things, it feels right based on reading the tooltips, but is this right? Is this good? But then we have there's a pro and con to this. So that's the con for me, is I'm not sure how I'm adding to the group dynamic, and I hope I'm doing okay. The pro of this is, and there is a pro, as we just talked about, you get your skills drip fed to you over like every 5 levels you'll get a new spell, or every 5 levels you get something else, and they're designed to work as a really cohesive unit much later in the game, which means your character might be dog shit weak right now compared to, say, a melee who's just picked up super cleave or something like that, which means if you had a damage meter, you might feel really bad that you're using the spells correctly and you're using them as intended, yet just due to the nature of you not having all the synergies and stuff, isn't going to perform particularly well now, but it will do later. So that aspect of it is a definite pro, is that some classes are going to get a little bit more powerful much earlier than you. They're going to get their synergies a little bit more earlier than you, and then you're going to get later on, and then you might...
Actually, a class I can think of immediately that will blow everyone out of the water in the early game is actually the Dancer, because of their AoE rotation that they have relatively early in the game. If you have 2 Dancers in the group, they just decimate everything in the early game. Like, no one that I can think of right now would be faster than them. They're like, there you go.
Leapfrog and overtake and all those kind of things, you may be off 1 level. Part of the interesting thing that happens with dungeons, before we get into... I'm going to tell you my best and my worst, is the level sync system. I really like the level sync system. In the open world, it's fine. The odd part about it, certainly in the early game where you're kind of flooded with experience, and I fully expect to cap, which would be level 50 for the content I'm doing, long before I actually finish the main story, which will allow me to progress, is that it does disable the use of spells that are not appropriate to that level. So if you're currently level 40 and you go into an area that's that syncs everybody to being, say, level 25, you're going to miss... they're just going to disable all the abilities that you had in those 15 level gap. And that's been a little awkward to get used to, because some of those things are really useful, particularly the procs and things that you get. I now have a proc with Thunder, but sometimes that...
That's true. That's one of the most annoying parts. That's why I don't like running the low-level dungeons when I actually do roulette. Even though I personally do very rarely any roulettes, but if I do them, I hate getting the low-level ones because half of my spells are missing. On the other hand, another thing that also works is if you level a character in like Palace of the Death or Heavens on High, you can actually, because you start your job at level 1 and then rush all the way to level 50 or 60, you can already map out your skills on where you want them on the hotkeys, and when you go out, they are still there. You can't use them, but as you level them in the real world, you can actually see where they go. So that's actually pretty nice.
Doesn't work because I've been level synced down. And that also means that a dungeon so far has been the best environment for me to really play around with my character's skills and abilities. However, I don't get to use a lot of those new skills and abilities, so I don't really get to do them. So I have to learn various play styles. Some of them feel very clunky going back and forward. So it's one of those pros and cons systems again, man. There's a good and bad side of it. The good side is you can do any dungeon you want, you get good experience, and you get to play with any of your friends regardless of what level they are. That's fantastic. The downside, of course, is that your gameplay... It goes from being much better to much worse. You're not honestly sure sometimes which spells and abilities work. At least I don't. Sometimes you'll be pressing a button, it's like, oh, that spell's deactivated, so it doesn't work. And in fact, sometimes you swapped spells into slots because you don't use the older spell anymore. Then you go into the dungeon, it's like, actually, my new spell no longer works, and now I have to go back to using my old one. And there's that little adjustment there. But overall, I think it's a positive system, is that people can jump in and play with their friends whenever they want to do. Let's talk about dungeons then. Absolutely mind blown. Absolutely just love this. Now, they're very, very easy, which is what I expected for this level. We're talking things... If we were doing a vanilla equivalent, we're talking our Rage Fire Chasms, right? We're talking about our early Cathedral runs, things like that. But what I really liked about them, one, I love that they give you a story of what the dungeon is before you go in. You have full context of what's going in there. That was a nice change for me, because I didn't know anything about the Scarlet Monastery before I stepped inside. I didn't know the WoW lore, and it doesn't really present it in a way that's interesting. But before you do the dungeons in FF, there's often a mini cutscene, maybe about a minute long. There's somebody who's explained to you what's going on there. Sometimes it's really dark and horrible, such as giants that have been buried for 200 years because they were slaves and broke free. And now we need those resources again. So we need to go back in and we need to kill them. So they've been slaves, then they were buried because they broke free. So they buried them alive for 200 years. Now we need to go back in and we need to kill them because they're now running amok and we still need those precious resources. So they have that darkness of the story I mentioned earlier. But I know the story. I know what's going on. I've got the context of what I'm doing. And I also have this moral quandary about what we're doing. I'm like, I don't really like this. Which makes the dungeon much more interesting. As well as the fly-through at the beginning of the dungeons, I think is fantastic. And also the mini cutscene that plays as the last boss approaches, giving it some more gravitas, letting you know this is, you know, a more interesting encounter. From a mechanics standpoint, though, one thing I really enjoyed was that even from dungeon number 1, there's extra things going on that you need to pay attention to. Now, although you can absolutely just blast the boss and ignore those things, that doesn't matter to me. I still want to learn the mechanics of stuff, what's going on. And try to figure that out is really fun because you don't often see that, certainly in early leveling dungeons. Like, everybody remembers Herod's Blade Storm or whatever. But that's very visually obvious, and it still catches a lot of people out. This one has you pulling levers, it has you blocking pipes, it has you dealing with...
This particular dungeon actually has... It's one of the very few dungeons who do have secrets. With the levers that you have to pull, and then you can open extra rooms to get the treasures, etc., etc. Most people actually don't do that these days, but if you do want, there are many treasure chests to be have in that particular dungeon.
Adds, what is this ad doing? If we don't deal with this ad, he's going to be doing this. We have to deactivate lamps, we have to position these laser beams and all this kind of stuff. So cool to see that stuff, and I'm really genuinely excited to see what comes after that. Like, how does this increase? How does this get more and more interesting? And also, from a nerd point of view, min-maxing your play. I want to go back into some of these dungeons, and I've said this several times, that I want to do that dungeon again because I can perform better in that dungeon. My best dungeon so far has been the Sunken Temple of Khan. I'm sorry if I get some of these names wrong, so that a lot of the dungeons have weird names. But I believe it's the Sunken Temple of Khan. This was fantastic. This had this very Oldum vibe going into it. And it was just a magnificent place with living statues, having to position head blocks over switches, having to unlock so many different treasure rooms, having this mini game that you can play inside, which can give you more loot, but it might also punish you if you get it wrong. Having all those different elements of being a very clear and open area to be in. Vice versa, my worst dungeon was the Copper Bell Mines, which was very claustrophobic to the point the camera didn't work. Had a boss in there that you don't attack, which was just mind-blowing that anybody would put this in there. There was this slime boss in there that you just don't do anything. You stand still.
Did he understood that someone has to use the blasting thing? That dungeon specifically is supposed to teach you that there might be things in the environment to use to deal with a boss. Now, why did they do that? Because the expectation is 8 years ago you might not have an idea on how to play a dungeon. So, and it's the Japanese. They always need these kind of things in there. I don't think it's that bad. Actually, it's one of my more favorite bosses. Yes, it's a little bit more boring, but you just sit back and watch someone get the bomb, and that's it.
And then eventually it dies because you just have to let the tank deal with everything, and the entire group just stands around waiting for it to happen. There's some very weird decisions in there. But overall, I've done about 6 dungeons now. I've done a spooky manor, which was very, very cool, which was kind of a maze and finding little keys everywhere to open up the passageways. That was awesome. But those are definitely my plus and minuses, so my best and worst so far. The next things I'm excited about is I definitely want to do the raids once I hit level 50. I'm really excited to see how that goes. I want to experience the larger raids, because so far I've done one major primal called Ifrit, which was a mini raid encounter, That was awesome. Like, you can't take away from this game the visual and audio spectacle that goes on in its bigger set-piece encounters. That was really, really cool, and kind of the first little inkling of what a raid is going to look like.
I'm always happy when someone mentions how visually appealing the trial encounters are. It's not only the trials, the raids as well, but when you, for the first time, you go to Ifrit and Garuda and Titan, it is so amazing visually, and the music. Everyone who mentions the music gets my personal like, so I already liked it. It's just really so great, and I wish more people would recognize that.
Want to do more of that. I'm sure I'm going to do more primals in the next couple of days. But as soon as I hit level 50, I kind of want to do the raids before I move on to the next expansion, which is... I always get the name of this wrong. It's either Heaven's Ward or Heaven's Sword. One of those two things. Well, that's where I'm at so far. Like, still fully engaged. Still fully engaged in it. Very surprised that of which stories have grabbed me and which haven't. And really happy to see that my gameplay's getting much, much better. Whatever's next for me, I will let you guys know, because it's just going and going and going. There you have it. Just utterly mind-blown with the amount of stuff that I didn't know about. I absolutely didn't know about, but it's all working out kind of well. I'm so much happier now that the gameplay is picking up. I cannot wait to see what other dungeons have for me, and I certainly think we're going to be checking out the raids once we hit level 50, before we move into the next expansion and get a real feel for how the raiding is in Final Fantasy. Because that's going to be a big make or break for me. As you probably know, raiding is my favorite thing in the whole world. So thank you for watching the video, guys. If you're interested in anything else to do with us, please check out preachgaming.com. And I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
And that was that. I'm glad he's having fun. Another thing he was actually talking about is characters he didn't like. One of them being Tancred. And Tancred is one of the characters who has some of the largest character development. He also happens to dislike Alphino, or who doesn't at the beginning of the game, who also has one of the largest character development. So I'm interested in seeing how he feels about these two characters, specifically in like Heaven's Ward and Stormblood and Shadowbringers, because currently he pretty much hates them. But I think especially Tancred would be... Preach probably would be able to appreciate the character development for Tancred the most of all the WoW streamers. He is the one who probably can appreciate Tancred's characterization. So I'm really looking forward in seeing him playing Final Fantasy XIV in the future. And for now, that was it. And thank you for watching, and I wish everyone a lovely day.